Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first chapter of this class, Chapter 1 in Com 130. The title of the chapter is Understanding Media and Culture, an Introduction to Mass Communication. And that's exactly what we're going to do, kind of lay out the groundwork for lots of different forms of media, lots of different ways that we understand media and use media and criticize media. So let's get started. We're going to talk about a couple of things in this chapter. One of them is media itself, what constitutes media, the kind of things that we accept as media, how that role is changing. We're also going to talk about culture. When we talk about culture, we're going to focus mostly on what we call pop culture, things that have been around forever, have changed over the years. So just as music today is not the same as it was 40 years ago or 100 years ago or uh, you know, uh, several thousand years ago. Neither is fashion, styles of dancing, things like that. Some of the media we'll talk about and some of the ways they impact with culture will include social media, which is a relatively new phenomenon uh, stemming from our increasing use of the internet. And of course, radio hasn't been around forever. It's only been around since, the late 19th century, early 20th century. Television, the same. Movies also go back to their starts in the 19th century. Books have been around in various forms for centuries, but we'll also talk about the rise of television, different kinds of other forms of media that couldn't have been imagined even 10 years ago. So let's get started. So we'll start with some terms. One of the things we'll have to understand is the difference between mass communication, mass media, and culture. Mass communication is the actual transmission of information targeted to the population. So that is the form of transmitting the things that we do on the media. So that could be everything from your cell phone to microwave towers for cable and things like that. Those mediums, which are individual forms, include all kinds of digital, print, electronic media. The definition for mass media is various forms of media designed to inform and entertain a large audience. So, mass media is also newspapers, books, radio, video games, and many other things. Now, one of the things you need to know about going back to mass communication is it's the actual transmission is the key part there. How that information gets to you, how it gets communicated to you is the centerpiece of that definition. Mass media itself is just various forms of media that we all use, some or all of. Culture, a very simple definition from the text, is our shared values, attitudes, beliefs, and practices. Now, culture includes those shared values, but we all have individual values that we maintain based on an understanding of culture. So while culture can be very much a process of bringing people together under similar belief systems, what we've seen, of course, in the world today is that a lot of people are tearing down various forms of culture or rejecting various forms of traditional culture. And sometimes that is being done because it's politically motivated or because our belief in various systems of government, democracy have changed. And sometimes it's simply due to the fact that because of mass communication, we're able to be exposed to many more different belief systems than we would have even a dozen years ago. So the landscape is changing. There are new forms of media, particularly electronic sources. As I mentioned earlier, books have been around for a long time, but the internet is relatively new. Computers are relatively new. Smartphones are very new, relatively speaking. The iPhone, for example, hasn't been around that long. And there's been a shift in the sort of mass communication that people use. Newspapers are not uh, as as well regarded as they used to be. Radios can seem passe to other people. We talk about mass communication shifts. We're talking about a shift away from traditional newsmakers. In other words, sources of authority, whether it's law enforcement or government, to different types of non-traditional newsmakers. A good example of that is a blog. I mean, people make news through blogs. You create your own sense of mass communication and put out your own form of media depending on whether or not you create your own blog and put your own views out there. And lastly, like I said in the previous slide, we now have culture clashes. The shared values have shifted and fractured. No longer is, for example, there the Republican way or the Democrat way, or even for that matter, the independent way. There's various forms of factions and fractures among the political spectrum. So that's something to keep aware of. We don't all believe in one belief system anymore, if that was ever true. But now, because of the emergence of the mass media, we're much more likely to see those differences and see those changes than before. Marshall McLuhan is a well-regarded mass communication scholar, and in 1964 he coined the phrase, "The medium is the message." And that means simply, and it's still true today, that every medium delivers information in a special way. Newspapers deliver information, for example, in a certain way. If you want a little bit more timeliness, you might go to the online version of a newspaper. Or if you want something even faster, you might go to social media. Or you might go to live coverage on television. There's all those new and different systems of delivering information have pros and cons, which we'll be talking about throughout the semester. If you want to narrow it down, the chapter talks about 4 different roles of media in society. And one is, these are in no particular order, but one is to entertain. Whether it's watching movies, whether it's playing games on your phone, whether it's just doing other kinds of things that you like to kill time with or are amused by, solving puzzles, again with your smartphone. Media has always been there to entertain. In the early days, it might have been things like comic strips in newspapers or radio shows that came on in the 1930s and 40s that were primarily there to make people laugh and get away from the cares of their everyday life. Secondly, but not less importantly, the media is there to inform and educate. Again, looking back at traditional media, television, radio, newspapers, those sorts of things, they're a source of pure information. We'll talk about how that information comes out in terms of what are called gatekeepers in a little while. Or to provide simply education about things that are happening. Now, of course, now we have a lot of people saying the media has its own point of view, and of course, media has always had its own point of view. That goes back historically for centuries, and there's nothing new about that. It's just that it's become much more noticed than it might have been in the past. The media has a role to act as a public forum. In other words, a place where people can come and express their opinions. They can talk about what they're unhappy about or what they're happy about. They can express opinion, like in letters to the editor, or get on social media and put out information that they feel will help people positively. Or they can rant and get everybody upset about something. We've seen a lot of that. And the fourth role, and a role that probably the media itself, when I talk about media, I'm talking about mainstream traditional media, what that they aspire to is to monitor the government and similar institutions. In other words, the press is part of the media, and they often consider themselves what's called the fourth estate. There's the legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government. The press sometimes likes to think of itself as we're there to keep an eye on those other 3 forms of government. We're there to monitor them, to make sure that they're following the rules, that they're doing things that are fair, and that includes other institutions that are government or government-like, such as large banks and things like that. So that's become increasingly more difficult as people's views about what the press and the media in general should do has evolved or changed. And I would hope that by the end of this semester you'll have an appreciation for what the press does, whether you agree with it or not, you'll understand it. And keep in mind that when we talk about media, we're talking about everything from the company that makes movies, which is mostly for entertainment and also as a commercial process, to books, to the press, which is a part of the media under this giant umbrella, but sometimes is lumped in with other forms of media. Very briefly, I've got some slides here about, this is just sort of precursors to some other things we might talk about later in the semester, about print media. Centuries ago, we had handwritten clay tablets by various cultures, Egyptian cultures, some cultures in Africa, I believe. Papyrus, which is deer skin, handwritten and then hand printed books. In other words, we're going back quite a few centuries ago until a printer by the name of Johann Gutenberg in the 15th century, some say, invented movable metal type. Now, the difference is that there's some evidence that maybe he wasn't the actual person who thought up this idea, that other cultures might have come up with it slightly earlier, or that his wife actually invented the concept, but he was the printer that put it into practice. Movable type, in other words, individual letters that could be put inside of a hand made press and then inked up and imprinted on sheets, was not a new idea. The new idea there was that it was metal type. In other words, it was type that could be used, and when it was worn out, the letters could be melted down and create more letters. So, nevertheless, he's an important part of the history of print media. The penny papers, where newspapers were actually sold for about a penny each in the 1830s, were very inexpensive. They brought information and entertainment to the public in a very cheap way. They tended to focus sometimes on sensationalist stories. The media has been accused of sensationalism, the press has, I should say, over the centuries from time to time. In the 19th century, when better technology came along, and I'm talking about things like steam-powered printing presses, trains for better distribution, and other forms of mechanical inventions during the what's called the Industrial Revolution, that made, again, it easier and cheaper to spread newspapers to wider audiences. There was another huge breakout of what we might call sensational journalism in the 1920s in America and sometimes elsewhere, called yellow journalism, and there's a reason why it was called yellow journalism. It's a complicated story having to do with the fact that a certain comic strip was printed in yellow ink in the newspapers. And in the 1920s, there was a lot of engagement in what they might call stunt journalism. There was also, on the positive side, what's called muckraking, which is digging deep into corruption and exposing that and writing about that in a way that bettered society. As the 20th century came into being, and a little bit later, the 20s and even into the 30s, journalism began to be thought of more as a profession and a craft, not as something that just anybody with no credentials would do. Investigative reporting and the scientific method, applying the scientific method to researching, reporting, and editing stories came along again in the 30s and the 40s and has continued ever since. And then the last major stage, this is a very brief history of print media, is that print media has gone digital. Newspapers, magazines, book, advertising has all gone digital. And of course that happened in various stages and incarnations over the last 30 to 40 years. So that's a very brief, at-a-glance look at print media history. Same thing with radio. We'll cover this in more detail, probably, but experiments began in the late 1800s. Radio was widely available by the 1920s. In 1924, the then President Calvin Coolidge broadcast a speech that reached 20 million people, which was a huge audience, and that was the advantage of radio, of course, is that it could be heard live, instantly, to a large number of people, and the only expense was that they purchased, say, a radio receiver, a radio set. which most families had in their homes. And they were very large, almost furniture-looking appliances that people gathered around to listen to all the big news of the day, the outbreak of World War II, things like that. Radio history also was tied into popular shows, news, entertainment. Again, the talk radio, as you might think of it, didn't really exist too much, but there were plenty of radio shows that relied on broadcast scripts that were put out and entertain people. And again, I mentioned that sort of big radio set in the living room that was like a large piece of furniture in the early days. It served to bring people together. It kind of created this home bond. And you've probably seen photographs of families huddled around the radio set listening to important news or listening to their favorite radio show on Saturday night. Americans actually relied on the radio during times of crisis, such as wars. I mentioned World War II. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, which led to the start of World War II. Well into the 40s and 50s, radio was one of the primary sources of news for many Americans, particularly Americans who could not yet afford TV, although that became pretty popular by the 1950s. The other thing that radio did was it transitioned music from home phonographs to listening to music worldwide. And what I mean by that was if you wanted to listen to music before radio came around, you bought phonograph records and again had fairly large record players. The one I have in my home came from my grandparents, and it's an old Edison Victrola, and you can put these thick clay records on it and play them, and that's great. It had a big manual loudspeaker. It wasn't electrified except through the scratching of the needle. So when radio came along, however, those big phonograph records could still be played, but you were more likely to tune in the radio and listen to the BBC, listen to music from other countries, other parts of the world, because the signals then could be skipped pretty easily. And obviously radio really, really helped in the field of advertising, because for a relatively low rate, you could go local, you could go regional, you can even go national fairly cheaply with radio. And nowadays, when you have the radio on, and this is the same is true as television, when you have the radio on, you hear the same commercial that comes on every 10 minutes or 15 minutes. That's because from the early days on, radio time, advertising time was bought in what are called blocks. And you can say, well, per month we're going to give you 100 blocks at this fairly inexpensive rate. Once you produce a radio commercial, you can air it, and the stations could plug it in at certain times, and they can also use it as fillers late at night to make sure those blocks were heard by enough people. And there was saturation advertising. And of course, TV took over that role too. Speaking of which, a little bit about TV history as we start the semester. Experiments on TV began in the late 19th century. It was available by the 1930s. It was actually available on a modest basis in the late 1920s, but very few people had it. In 1946, which is one of the pivotal years in media history, there were only 17,000 TV sets. Now we have well over one per house. I've given up trying to keep up track because the last number I heard was 1.2 or 1.4 per house, which means that some people have one television in a house or none, and some people have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. I had one student once who told me they had 8 televisions in their house. I guess they like to watch TV while they're taking a bath or something. I can't think of a reason to have that many sets. And of course, now we can watch TV on a cell phone, a smartphone too. So in the beginning, there were various sources, say 2 or 3 networks. Now we have many networks and thousands of stations available through cable and other forms of satellite television. So the huge growth in television, again, this is just a tip of the iceberg kind of look at television history, was in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the major reason was this was post World War II. This was post Korea. And we became more affluent as a country. We had more working around money. This is the age of Eisenhower and when he was president, and John Kennedy later. And we had a little bit more money to burn. Now, I'm old enough to remember when we got our first color television set. We got our first color television set in 1967. And watching news footage from the Vietnam War in black and white versus color was really different. It really brought the war home for people that really weren't used to seeing uh, people that were shot up in color. So that's why I mentioned that the news over the course of the 50s, 60s, and to the present day has dramatically altered our social reality. I'm using the Vietnam War example for mine. But now because of the availability of television everywhere, and the fact that it can be live everywhere, which is not always a routine thing back in the early days of television, um, they at least on-site coverage, has changed the way we view our society because there's so much more, yes, triumphant stories, but also stories of tragedy out there that we're exposed to. And obviously, it's not on the slide here, but something that just occurred to me. Obviously, television has also affected the way children are exposed to violence and sex and sexism, and all of us are exposed to that in a different way. Cable TV, actually, there were versions of cable TV in the 1960s in a few remote parts of the country, Washington State, and I believe a couple of places on the East Coast. New Jersey might have been one of them, but really didn't come along for most of us till the 1980s and 1990s. And then 1996, the Telecommunications Act deregulated, and it created competition among the cable companies, the TV networks, and it was supposed to partly lead to a reduction in prices for us to get cable, but the truth of the matter is that cable rates have only gone up. In most communities, they haven't gone down because they're trying to pack more and more and more channels in to keep more and more people happy. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about photography in the movies. Photography is a special interest of mine. I've been doing it my whole life. I started at a very young age. Most people don't know that photography was actually invented in the early 1800s. About 1837, 1840, 1841, somewhere in there. Some of the early movie experimenters in the latter part of the 19th century were the Lumiere brothers and George Eastman, as in George Eastman that started Kodak. Lumiere brothers were very early experimenters in lantern shows that attracted the attention of crowds, and they developed a method to kind of make it look like people were watching movies, but they were actually just watching slides. First U.S. movies in general came around about 1905. By the 1920s, Hollywood had created this system of high-priced studios and stars. And the studios were good in the sense that they could build blockbuster films. They could had a lot of money to finance sets and hire actors and make movie stars out of people, but bad in the sense that independent films really didn't have a chance outside of the studio system. And that's carried out to some extent even to this day, although independent filmmakers are having a much easier time of it. In 1927, the first talkie movie, in other words, a movie that had recorded dialogue on it, was in a film starring Al Jolson. When we talk about movies, we'll talk about that. Color movies became fairly routine in the 1930s. A good example of that is Wizard of Oz, which came out in 1939. And the first little chunk of the movie is in black and white. And then the movie goes to color midstream because it's when Dorothy and everybody are trying to find the Wizard of Oz. And they're in this fantasy land, so everything is gold. And then when Dorothy wakes up home later on, she finds out that it's all been a dream. So that's an example of a movie that shifted from black and white to color in the middle of the movie, which was kind of unusual at the time. I mentioned 1946 earlier being kind of a keystone year in media history. The height of the movie theaters themselves were at their height of their popularity in 1946. Again, that's right after World War II, and people were so sick of the war and so sick of the sacrifices that they had to make for the war that they really wanted to have a good time. They wanted to listen to music. They wanted to jump on the television bandwagon. They wanted to go to the movies. And movie theater attendance has not reached that same level this day that it did in 1946. One of the things that started happening in the 60s and 70s and continued to this day is the rise of multiplex theaters. That simply means one theater that holds many different screening rooms. And there's some across the country that have as many as, I think, 40 or 50 screens, maybe more. In a lot of theaters we're used to seeing 5 or 6 or 7 screens. Drive-in movie theaters used to be really popular, but they have severely declined since the 1950s. My wife and I still go to the drive-in theater at least once a year just for nostalgia's sake, but they kind of fall off in popularity because if you go in the summer, it's kind of hot out and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of noise and traffic and people running around, and most people don't want that experience from a movie. They want to go into a movie palace. They want to go into a place where they're going to be able to have food brought to them, or an alcoholic beverage, or both. And they want to have comfortable seats, and they want to enjoy themselves. They don't want to be out in a hot, sticky summer kind of summer night experience. So that's all for part 1 of chapter 1. I've got another video for you to watch that concludes some of the other material that's in chapter 1, and I hope you enjoyed this. And as always, I welcome feedback. If you have any questions about any of this material, feel free to call or email. Email might be the easiest thing. The email address for me is on the syllabus. And if we need to talk or you want to visit, we can do that too. Thanks very much.